The morning Susan Whitfield walked through the smoldering ruins of everything she had ever owned. The whole town of Caldwell, Kansas, came out to watch her grieve, and not a single one of them understood that their pity was the cruelest thing they could offer her. It was the autumn of 1879, and Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a nail driven crooked into the Kansas prairie. A cattle town full of dust and ambition and men who drank too much and dreamed too large. Susan had lived there for 6 years, first as the wife of Thomas Whitfield, a good and steady man who had built her a dry goods store with his own 2 hands, and then as his widow, running that store alone after a fever took him in the winter of 1877. She had kept it going through sheer stubbornness and the kind of quiet competence that made people forget to admire her until she was no longer there. The fire had started sometime before dawn on a Tuesday in September. No one knew exactly how. Some said it was a lamp left burning in the back room. Others whispered about Harlan Doyle, the man who ran the competing mercantile 2 streets over, who had been making ugly noises about Susan's prices undercutting his business. But there was no proof of anything, and by the time the bucket brigade reached the building, the whole structure was a column of orange light against the black sky, and Susan was standing in the street in her nightgown with a shawl around her shoulders, watching 2 years of her solitary labor disappear into ash. She had not cried. That was the thing people talked about afterward. She had stood there with her jaw set and her eyes dry and watched the fire eat her life down to the foundation, and not a single tear had moved down her face. The women of Caldwell found this unsettling. They expected her to collapse, to be caught, to need something from them. When she did not, they compensated by doubling the sympathy they pressed on her. By the time the sun came fully up and the embers were cooling, Susan had received 17 offers of temporary housing, 11 covered dishes of food she had not asked for, 8 expressions of condolence delivered in the hushed tones people reserved for funerals, and 3 separate suggestions that perhaps it was time for her to consider moving back east to live with family. Mrs. Caldwell, the mayor's wife, had actually taken Susan's hand between both of hers and said, in the gentlest possible voice, that perhaps this was God's way of telling a woman she was not meant to carry such a burden alone. Susan had thanked her with a smile that did not reach her eyes and extracted her hand and said nothing. She spent the morning standing at the edge of the ruins, making a quiet inventory. The stone foundation had survived. The iron stove in the back was intact, merely sitting in a heap of charred wood and debris. The safe, bless its solid iron heart, had protected the cash inside. She had perhaps enough money saved to begin again. If she was careful, if she moved quickly, if she could find lumber at a fair price, and someone willing to help her frame the building before winter set in hard. The Kishom Trail season was winding down, the last of the cattle drives coming through before the cold months, and she needed to be operational before spring if she wanted to catch the business that came with the new drives. She was thinking through all of this, turning the numbers over in her head the way Thomas had taught her, when she heard boots on the gritty ground behind her and turned, already composing her face into the polite mask she had been wearing all morning. Henry Vaughn was not a man who made an immediate impression. He was 32 years old, lean and weathered in the particular way that men who worked outdoors in Kansas became, with dark hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that had a habit of looking at things with such frank directness that it sometimes made people uncomfortable. He had come to Caldwell 8 months earlier, buying the old Prescott land on the edge of town, a parcel that had gone fallow for 3 years, and setting about the unglamorous work of making it productive again. He was not the richest man in town, not the most prominent, not the most charming. He was simply competent in a way that was rarely celebrated but always useful. Susan had seen him perhaps a dozen times. He had come into her store twice, purchased nails and rope on one occasion and a length of canvas on another, paid without haggling, said little beyond what was required. She had thought him reserved to the point of coldness, but she had been busy, and she had not thought about him much beyond that. He stopped a few feet from her and looked at the ruins the way a carpenter looks at a job, systematically, without sentiment, moving his gaze from the foundation to the frame remnants to the standing chimney on the east wall. Susan waited for the sympathy. She had been waiting for it all morning from everyone and receiving it and filing it away in the growing pile of things that were not useful. Henry looked at the foundation for a long moment, then he looked at her. "The stonework is solid," he said. "You can build on that." She stared at him. He glanced around at the debris. "You will need to clear this first, couple of days of work. Then you want a frame before the ground freezes, which gives you maybe 6 weeks if the weather holds." He looked at the chimney. "That is standing true. You keep that, save yourself some cost." "I know," she said, and her voice came out differently than it had all morning, less careful, more direct. "I have been standing here working out the same thing." He looked at her then with those level gray eyes, and for just a moment she felt seen in a way she had not been all day, perhaps all year. "I have tools," he said, "and I can spare time from the farm through the end of the week. I have cleared land before, which is near the same work." She opened her mouth, and some reflex of politeness almost made her say that she could not possibly impose the same gentle deflection she offered to everyone. But she stopped herself. "What would you want for it?" she asked instead. Something shifted slightly in his expression, something that might have been respect or recognition. "Fair wage," he said. "Whatever you would pay any day laborer." "I cannot afford fair wage for the full job," she said honestly. "I have the money to rebuild, but I will need every dollar for materials." He considered this. "Then we negotiate. Materials for the first week I will come on partnership of labor. You feed me, I work. When the store is open, you pay back the labor cost over the first 2 months of business." It was, she realized, a better deal than she could have arranged herself, and he had offered it without making her feel like a charity case. It was just business. It was just practical. "Done," she said, and held out her hand. He shook it the way he would shake any business partner's hand, firm and brief, and she felt calluses on his palm from real work. "I will be back at first light tomorrow with a sledge and some rope," he said. "We can start clearing." He turned and walked back through the dispersing crowd, and no one paid him much attention, and Susan watched him go with a feeling she could not quite name yet, something between relief and surprise and the first genuine warmth she had felt since the sky turned orange in the early morning hours. She turned back to the ruins. He was going to bring her a hammer. Well, something close enough to it. And it was the only offer all morning that had made her feel like herself. The first morning they worked together, Susan wore her oldest dress and tied her dark hair back under a kerchief, and she was already pulling charred timber to the side when Henry arrived with a wagon and 2 draft horses and a sledge, and the kind of organized efficiency that told her he had planned the work the night before. He greeted her with a nod and went directly to the heaviest beams without ceremony, and she appreciated that more than she could say. He had brought a young man with him, a hired hand from his farm named Jesse, who was perhaps 19 or 20 and worked hard without being asked. The 3 of them moved through the debris with a rhythm that developed naturally over the course of the morning, each finding their work without needing to discuss it constantly. Henry made decisions quickly and explained them concisely when explanation was needed, and he spoke to Susan exactly as he spoke to Jesse, without softening his words or slowing them down. And this was so unusual that she found herself standing still for a moment just to register it. At mid-morning, she brought out coffee from the pot she had set up in the temporary space Mrs. Haverford had lent her, a corner of the woman's kitchen that Susan was using as a makeshift office, and Henry took the cup and drank it standing, looking at the work they had done. "You had this organized well," he said, meaning the store, "the layout of the foundation. Whoever built it put the load points in the right places." "My husband built it," she said. There was a brief pause that was not uncomfortable. "He knew his work," Henry said, and left it there, which was exactly the right thing. "He did," she agreed. They went back to work. By the end of the 3rd day, the site was cleared, and the foundation was swept clean, and Henry had walked her through his plans for the framing with a stub of pencil on a piece of salvaged paper, showing her where he intended to adjust the original layout to give her a wider front window for display, a change he thought would improve her sales to passing traffic. She had looked at the sketch for a long time and then suggested moving the interior partition 2 feet to the west to give more room to the supply area in the back, and he had looked at her suggestion and nodded and updated the sketch without argument, and she had thought, "This is a man who is actually listening." The town watched with interest. Caldwell was the kind of place where everyone watched everything, not maliciously mostly, but because there was not always a great deal to watch, and a widow woman rebuilding her business with the help of a quiet farmer from the edge of town was at least something to discuss. Mrs. Caldwell informed her friend Mrs. Hare that it was peculiar, the arrangement. Mrs. Hare relayed to Mrs. Fowler that Henry Vaughn had been seen arriving at the site before sunrise on the 4th day, which Mrs. Fowler found very interesting indeed. The men at the saloon were more direct about it. There was some talk, not all of it kind, about a woman doing manual labor and what that said about her character, and whether Vaughn's interest was purely professional. Susan heard some of this second-hand. She did not pay it much attention. She was too busy, and she had long since stopped organizing her choices around what Caldwell thought of them. But she noticed Henry in ways she had not expected. She noticed that he could lift a corner post into place with one sustained push that looked effortless but which, when she tried to judge the weight, clearly was not. She noticed that he spent 15 minutes one afternoon on a measurement that seemed already correct to her, checking and rechecking with a care that she recognized as the same care she took with the accounts, the unwillingness to guess when precision was available. She noticed that he had a habit, when thinking through a problem, of pushing his hat up with one finger and staring at whatever the problem was with an expression of patient concentration, and that he never seemed frustrated by difficulty, only interested in solving it. On the 5th day, the lumber arrived from the mill in Wichita, and Henry and Jessie unloaded it while Susan accounted for every board against her order list, checking lengths and marking discrepancies. And when she found 2 boards cut short, she went directly to the driver of the delivery wagon and contested the charge with such precise reference to the order form that the man gave up arguing within 2 minutes. Henry, who had been watching from across the lot, turned back to his stacking with a small smile she was not meant to see. She saw it. That evening, as the light went amber and the plains stretched out golden behind the town, they sat on the tailgate of his wagon and ate the bread and cold chicken she had packed, and it was the first time they had sat still together, and the first time the conversation moved beyond the work. "Where did you come from?" she asked. "Before Caldwell. Missouri, originally," he said. "Then Colorado for a while, had a mining claim that went nowhere. Then I decided dirt was more reliable than rock." "Meaning farming." "Meaning farming," he agreed. He looked out at the horizon. "There is something honest about land. You put work in, you get something out. It is not always fair, the weather sees to that, but at least the terms are clear." She thought about that. "The store is the same in some ways," she said. "You stock what people need, you price it right, you keep your accounts straight, the terms are clear." "You are good at it," he said simply. She looked at him. "Most people would not say that directly." "Most people?" he asked. "Most men," she said, and let the plainness of it sit between them. He did not flinch from it. "I imagine that is true," he said. "I also imagine it is tiresome." "Extremely," she said, with a feeling very close to laughter. He looked at her, and for a moment the amber light was on his face, and she saw something in his expression that was careful and genuine at the same time, a look that said he was attending to her very closely. "Well," he said, "for what it is worth, you are building this store back the way a person builds something they intend to keep. That tells me everything I need to know about your ability." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Thank you, Henry," she said, and used his first name for the first time, and felt the small shift that made in the air between them. "Susan," he said, acknowledging it quietly. They finished their meal and talked for another hour about the work plan for the following week. But underneath the practical exchange, there was something new threading through the conversation, something careful and warm and not yet named. The framing went up over the following 2 weeks, and the building began to take shape against the sky. And every morning Henry appeared at first light, and every evening they talked longer than strictly necessary before he drove his wagon back to the edge of town. Jesse began to leave a little early on certain evenings, with the transparent tact of a young man who had noticed something his employer had not yet said aloud, and Henry pretended not to notice Jesse's early departures, and Susan pretended not to notice that Henry did not mind them. Harlan Doyle came by on a Wednesday morning, which Susan noted because Doyle rarely came anywhere without a specific purpose. He was a heavy man in his 50s with small eyes and the kind of professional friendliness that covered harder feelings, and he stood at the edge of the building site and looked at the progress and said, loudly enough for several bystanders to hear, that it was a real shame about the fire, and that if Susan found herself overwhelmed by the burden of reconstruction, his offer to buy the lot remained open. Susan looked at him steadily. "It does not remain relevant, Mr. Doyle," she said. "But thank you." Doyle's eyes moved to Henry, who was at the far end of the building fitting a window frame, and something in Doyle's expression shifted in a way that made Susan uneasy, though she could not say exactly why. "Vaughn," Doyle called out, "farming must be slow if you have time to play carpenter." Henry did not look up from the window frame. "Farming is fine," he said pleasantly. "Window is nearly level, Mrs. Whitfield. Come check the line." It was a small masterpiece of dismissal, and Susan went to check the line with a feeling of warmth in her chest that she was beginning to have difficulty explaining away as mere professional satisfaction. After Doyle left, she said, low enough that only Henry could hear, "Do you think he set the fire?" Henry was quiet for a moment, fitting a peg into the frame. "I do not have proof of anything," he said, "but I think a man who wants your lot enough to come here and advertise that want is a man worth watching." "I think so too," she said. He looked at her directly. "If something troubles you or if something happens, you come find me." It was not said with drama. It was said the way you say something you simply mean, and she felt it settle somewhere deep and quiet inside her. The roof went on in the 3rd week of October. Jesse and 2 other men Henry had brought in from his farm crew working through a cold, gray day, while Susan kept the coffee hot and laid out the shingles in order, and did not pretend to need any help with the work she could do herself. She was up on the low section of the roof by mid-afternoon, handing shingles up, and she heard one of the farm hands say something to Jesse under his breath and Jesse say something back, and neither of them said anything to her, because Henry had spoken to them in advance, she suspected, in ways she would never know about. Henry himself came up beside her at one point on the sloping roof, both of them braced against the chill wind, and he steadied a shingle against the line and drove nails with 3 clean strokes, and she watched the efficiency of it and said, without thinking it through first, "You make it look like you have been doing this your whole life." "I have been doing something like it," he said. "We built everything in Missouri: barn, house, root cellar. My father believed if you could not build a thing yourself, you did not really own it." "I believe that too," she said. He looked at her with that particular attention he had. "I know you do," he said. She had to look away from him because the directness of it, the simple acknowledgement that he had been watching her closely enough to know something true about her, was more than she had known what to do with in a long time. That night she stayed late at the site, looking at the shape of the building in the dusk, the new walls solid and square, the roof lying clean against the darkening sky. It was not the same as what she had lost, but it was something. It was something she was building herself with help that was given honestly, and she felt, for the first time since the night of the fire, not diminished by loss, but enlarged by the effort of answering it. She heard his wagon, recognized the sound of his particular horses before she heard him pull up behind her. "I forgot my level," he said, climbing down. "You did not forget your level," she said, not turning around. A pause, Then quietly, "No." She turned then, and he was standing in the blue dusk with his hat in his hands, and the light was all going soft, and the town was settling into its evening sounds, and she looked at him and felt something very clear and very certain move through her. "Henry," she said, "I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said, "standing here in the dark alone." "I am fine," she said. "I was just looking at it." "It looks right," he said. "You should be proud." "I am," she said, "and I am grateful, not in the way that makes me feel small, in the way that feels like finding out someone was paying attention when you did not expect it." He was quiet for a moment. "I have been paying attention," he said, "since before the fire, if I am honest. You would come in the store looking like a person carrying the whole weight of something and managing it so cleanly that most people never saw the weight at all. I saw it." She absorbed that slowly. The wind moved across the prairie behind the town, carrying the smell of dry grass and coming cold, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote said something brief and mournful to the dark. "That is a very honest thing to say," she said. "I prefer honest," he said. "I have found it is faster." She laughed, a real laugh, and it surprised her, the realness of it, the ease. He smiled, and it changed his face considerably, made it warmer and younger, and she thought she would like to see that smile regularly. "It is cold," he said. "Can I drive you back to Mrs. Haverford's?" "Yes," she said, "you can." They rode through the dark streets of Caldwell in his wagon, sitting side by side in the way that was common and practical, and also, they both knew, something more than that. And when he handed her down from the wagon at Mrs. Haverford's gate, he held her hand a moment longer than necessary, and she let him, and they looked at each other in the dark with the clean honesty that was apparently the only language either of them really spoke. "First light tomorrow," he said. "First light," she agreed. She went inside with her heart doing something it had not done in a very long time, and she sat down at Mrs. Haverford's kitchen table and stared at the lamp flame for a while before she went to bed. November came with cold wind and the last of the cattle season closing down, and Caldwell shed its summer roughness and became a quieter, more settled version of itself. The cowboys and drovers gone south or to winter quarters, the saloons less rowdy, the streets less churned with horses. The store was enclosed now, wind-tight, and Susan was fitting the interior with shelving, while Henry finished the front counter, and Jessie glazed the windows with careful attention. They had begun to fall into a natural rhythm together that was neither purely professional nor yet openly romantic, a middle territory that was sweet with possibility and also slightly maddening. Susan, who had been married and was not unaware of her own feelings, recognized what was happening. She was not a woman who needed things spelled out for her, but she also did not know quite what Henry was waiting for, whether he was simply careful by nature or whether something was holding him back. She got her answer on a Saturday when she went to fetch lumber samples from the mill shed and found Harlan Doyle already there, talking to the mill owner, Mr. Beckwith, in tones that stopped when she came in. Doyle looked at her with those small eyes and said, pleasantly enough, that he heard the store was coming along, and then he said something that was not pleasant at all. He said that he imagined she was grateful to have a man like Vaughn to lean on, since a woman running a business alone in this town was always going to find it difficult, and that he had spoken to a few of the suppliers she used regularly and suggested they might want to review their arrangements with her. Susan felt the blood come up in her face, and she kept very still. "What suppliers?" she said. Doyle waved a hand vaguely. "Only a friendly conversation," he said. "Business talk, you understand." She understood perfectly. He was trying to cut off her supply lines. He had probably been making quiet moves against her for months, maybe longer. She bought her lumber samples from Mr. Beckwith without another word to Doyle and walked back to the store site and stood at the counter Henry was fitting and told him what had happened, plainly and completely, because she had learned that he was the right person to tell things plainly. Henry listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How many suppliers?" he asked. He mentioned it vaguely. "I need to write letters, find out which ones he has spoken to." "I know the man who runs the General Wholesale House in Wichita," Henry said. "Miles Archer. Good man, sensible. I will write to him directly, explain the situation. If Doyle has been there, Archer will tell me, and his testimony would carry weight." She looked at him. "You would do that?" "Why would I not?" He was fitting a dovetail joint as he spoke, hands moving with the same steady competence they always had. "You have done nothing wrong. He is trying to harm your business out of competitive spite, possibly with more behind it. The right response is to document it and speak to people before he does." "I cannot prove he set the fire," she said. "Not yet," Henry said. He looked up at her then, and his gray eyes were direct and serious. "But I have been asking quiet questions. The fire investigator, Mr. Pierce, is a methodical man. I have spoken to him twice. He is not satisfied with the lamp theory." She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. "Why did you not tell me this before?" "Because I did not want to tell you something half-formed," he said. "When there is something solid to say, I will say it." She stared at him. "Henry." "Yes." "You have been doing all of this, investigating Doyle, writing letters, carrying wood and driving nails and coming before sunrise, and you have not said anything to me about the larger part of it." He set down his chisel. He looked at her with that level attention. "I thought," he said carefully, "that you did not need someone telling you what was being done for you. I thought you would want to know when there was something concrete and useful. Was I wrong?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "You were not wrong, but I still want to know." "Then I will tell you everything from now on," he said simply. They looked at each other across the half-built counter, and the early winter light came through the new glass windows and lay pale and clean across the sawdust floor. And Susan felt something break open in her chest in the best possible way, something that had been held carefully closed for a long time. "Henry," she said again, and her voice was different this time. He came around the counter and stood before her, and he looked at her the way he looked at everything, with total, unhurried attention. "Susan," he said, "I have been wanting to say something for several weeks." "Then say it," she said. "I would very much like to court you properly," he said, "if you are willing, and if the timing is not wrong. I am aware you are still, that the fire was not long ago, and that you have a great deal to manage, and I am not trying to be one more thing you have to manage. I am trying to say that I would like the chance to be something else entirely, if you want that." She looked at him for a long moment, this quiet, competent, honest man who had walked through her ruins and handed her a hammer and never once made her feel like a disaster to be managed. "The timing," she said, "is exactly right." He reached out and took her hand, the same businesslike hand that had shaken hers on the first morning, and held it differently now, and she let him. When Jesse came back from his errand 20 minutes later, and found them still talking across the counter with their hands clasped, and Susan's face wearing an expression he had never seen on it before, he set down his supply box very quietly and went back out, and did not come back for another hour. He reported to the farm hands that evening that it was about time, and they agreed unanimously. Courting in Caldwell in 1879 was a public affair, understood and observed by everyone, and Henry conducted it with the same seriousness he applied to everything he undertook. He came to Mrs. Haverford's on Sunday evenings after the work week and sat in the parlor and talked to Susan for 2 hours, and on Wednesdays he brought her something from his farm, vegetables from the root cellar, a jar of his housekeeper's preserved peaches, a small bunch of late prairie wildflowers that he had clearly stopped to gather on his way into town because they were still fresh and slightly damp. Mrs. Haverford, who approved of Henry on the grounds that he looked a person directly in the eye when he spoke, served them coffee, and then found reasons to be in the kitchen. Mrs. Caldwell told Mrs. Hare that she supposed it was a reasonable match if an unusual one, since Henry Vaughn was not exactly a prominent figure. Mrs. Hare relayed to Mrs. Fowler that Susan Whitfield seemed happy, which none of them could quite argue with. The men at the saloon generally considered the whole thing settled and moved on to other topics. Harlan Doyle said nothing to anyone about it directly, but his small eyes tracked Henry's wagon whenever it came through the main street, and Susan noticed and said nothing. The letters she and Henry had sent to suppliers came back over the following weeks, and most of them were reassuring. The suppliers had received Doyle's overtures but had not acted on them, most of them valuing their business relationship with her store too highly to abandon it on the word of a competitor. Miles Archer in Wichita wrote to Henry directly, confirming that Doyle had indeed suggested Susan's store was a poor credit risk, a claim Archer had rejected as unsupported by any evidence he had seen. Archer said he would be happy to provide a written statement if one was needed. The fire investigation, meanwhile, was moving quietly forward in the hands of Mr. Pierce. In mid-November, Pierce came to the store site and asked Susan several specific questions about the lamp in the back room, the last time she had used it, whether she had a pattern of checking it before she locked up, and other questions about the building's layout and access. He was a careful man who wrote everything in a small notebook, and Susan answered him precisely and completely. Afterward, she stood with Henry outside the building and said, "He knows something." "He is close to something," Henry agreed. There was a witness. One of the men who works for me, Caleb. He was returning from a card game late that night. He saw someone near the building an hour before the fire was noticed. He did not think anything of it at the time. He told me 2 weeks ago. "Doyle," she said. "I do not know that," Henry said carefully. Caleb could not see clearly. It was dark. He only noted a figure on foot, but I told Pierce, and Pierce is working on it. Will anything come of it? I do not know, he said honestly. Pierce is thorough, but thorough takes time, and a figure in the dark is not a conviction. He looked at her. "I want you to know something." "Tell me," she said. "Regardless of what happens with Doyle or the investigation, you are going to open this store. You are going to do what you set out to do. Whatever he did or did not do, it did not stop you. That is the only part that is truly in your hands, and you have handled it completely." She stood still for a moment, absorbing this. "I have had help," she said. "You made the decisions," he said. "Every day you were here making decisions. I brought tools. You built something." She looked at the building, solid and new in the November light, the storefront with its wide window, the straight roof line, the sign she had not yet put up but had already ordered from the sign painter in Wichita. It was hers. More truly hers than the original had been, she thought, because she had built this one through the hardest months of her life, and she had done it with eyes open. "Henry," she said. "Yes." She turned to look at him. The wind was cold off the prairie, and her breath made small clouds in the air, and she was wearing her heavy coat, and her hair was coming loose from its pins as it always did when she worked outside, and she felt not at all like someone who should be saying what she was about to say, and she said it anyway. "I am in love with you." He looked at her, and she saw something happen in his face that she would think about for the rest of her life, a kind of careful, still joy, like a man who has been waiting for something and does not quite believe it has arrived. "Susan," he said. "I know it is early," she said. "But I have been very practical my whole life, and I have been alone for 2 years, and I know the difference between feeling safe and feeling something, and this is something." He reached up and took her face gently between his two work-roughened hands and looked at her with everything showing, none of his usual careful reserve, just the thing itself, clear and warm and entirely certain. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since the morning I came to look at those ruins, and you were already there ahead of me, measuring the foundation with your boot heel." She made a sound that was almost a laugh, and he kissed her, careful and warm, and the Kansas wind blew cold around them, and neither of them cared. December came in hard and bright, the prairie flat and iron cold under a pale sky, and the store was ready to open. Susan had spent 2 weeks stocking shelves and arranging merchandise and writing to suppliers to confirm the opening date, and Henry had made a wooden sign that said WHITFILD dry goods in clean, even letters, which he hung above the door on a clear, cold morning while she watched from the street with her arms folded, and her heart doing something she was beginning to trust. "It is straight," he said, coming down the ladder. "Perfectly straight," she confirmed. They opened on the 2nd of December, 1879, which Susan noted in her ledger with a satisfaction that felt enormous and private and entirely her own. The town came, more of it than she expected, drawn by curiosity and the genuine goodwill that sits underneath even the most irritating pity when the emergency is past. And Susan worked behind her new counter in her good dress and answered questions, and wrote up orders and made change, and felt the particular pleasure of a thing running the way you built it to run. Henry came in mid-morning and bought nails and a length of good rope, and paid without haggling, same as he always had, except that when he turned to leave, he looked back at her over the heads of the other customers with a smile that was private and warm and entirely for her, and she caught it and held it like something small and valuable. After closing that evening, they sat in the store in the lamplight and she showed him the day's accounts, and he listened with genuine interest, and they drank coffee from the pot on the new iron stove and talked until the lamp burned low. It was a domesticity that felt so natural and right that its newness was almost startling. "Will you stay in Caldwell?" she asked. "The farm. The farm is good land," he said. "It will be better in 2 more years if the weather cooperates. I intend to stay." "Good," she said simply. He looked at her over his coffee cup. "Is that the only reason you ask?" "No," she said, "but it is the practical one." "What is the other reason?" She looked at him steadily. "Because I would like you to be nearby, for a long time." He set down his cup and reached across the counter and took her hand. "Then I will be." Christmas in Caldwell was a modest affair, the town too rough around its edges for elaborate celebration, but there were church services and communal dinners, and the small acts of seasonal generosity that come to any community that has spent a hard year together. Susan attended the Christmas service at the small Methodist church and sang the hymns in her clear, slightly low voice, and Henry sat beside her, which everyone noticed and some approved and others merely observed. And afterward there was a gathering at the community hall with hot cider and dried fruit cake and fiddle music. Henry asked her to dance once, which was the appropriate number for a couple who were courting, and they moved through the familiar pattern of a Virginia reel with a dozen other couples, and she felt his hand at her back and the warmth of him close, and thought that she had not expected this autumn to end this way, and was profoundly glad. The news about Harlan Doyle came in January. Mr. Pierce came to the store on a Tuesday morning with his small notebook and his careful manner, and told Susan that he had sufficient evidence to bring a charge of arson against Harlan Doyle. A second witness had come forward, a woman who lived in the house adjacent to the alley behind the store, who had been wakeful that night and had looked out her window and seen a man she recognized as Doyle carrying something toward the back of Susan's building. Combined with Caleb's account, the testimony of Miles Archer regarding Doyle's business interference, and certain physical evidence Pierce had recovered from the ruins during a second examination, the case was solid enough to take before the circuit judge. Susan sat with this for a moment very still. "He burned it deliberately," she said. "I believe so," Pierce said carefully, "because he wanted my lot. And because your prices were better than his and your service was better and he was losing customers to you before the fire." She looked at her hands on the counter. She thought about the night, the orange sky, the smell of smoke, the kerchief neighbors pressing into her hands with their well-meant sympathy. She thought about standing in the ruins with nothing. "What happens now?" she asked. "The circuit judge comes through in March," Pierce said. "Doyle will be arrested and held until trial. I want you to be prepared for the fact that he will have a lawyer and the lawyer will challenge the witness testimony, and it will not be simple." "I understand," she said. She did not cry, but she sat behind her counter for a long while after Pierce left, very quiet, with the January light coming through her good front window. Henry came in that afternoon and she told him everything, and he sat across the counter from her and listened without interrupting, and when she finished he said, "Are you all right?" "I am angry," she said, and was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I am very angry, not at you or at Pierce or at the process." At the fact that someone decided to destroy what I had built because I was successful at it, and he found that inconvenient. That is entirely the right thing to be, he said. I am also, she said and paused. I am also aware that I rebuilt it and it is better and I have things now I did not have before. She looked at him, specific things, important ones. He held her gaze. I am aware, he said, that I am the beneficiary of something terrible that happened to you and I do not take that lightly. You are not the beneficiary of the fire, she said firmly. You are the result of what I did with the fire. There is a difference. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said, there is. She reached across the counter and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. The winter settled deep and the store did good business, and Henry came in every week and on Sundays came to Mrs. Haverford's, and on Wednesday evenings sometimes they walked the cold, quiet streets of the town together, because they had both discovered independently that they liked to walk. And the conversations they had during those walks ranged from the practical to the philosophical to the personal in ways that continually surprised and delighted her. Henry had read more than she expected, had thought more carefully about more subjects than she expected, and she had learned that beneath the economy of his speech was a mind that had considered things at length and arrived at positions it held thoughtfully but not rigidly. He told her about Missouri, his family, his mother who had been the practical center of their household and his father who had been visionary and sometimes unreliable, the older brother who had gone to the war and come back different. He told her about Colorado, the years in the mining camp, the particular loneliness of living among men who were all in transit, all waiting for something else, no one building. He told her he had come to Caldwell because the land was available and the price was fair, and he had wanted finally to build something that would stay. She told him about Ohio, where she had grown up the eldest of 5 children, her mother a schoolteacher and her father a man, who had moved the family twice chasing opportunity and found it reluctantly both times. She told him about Thomas, carefully and honestly, that it had been a good marriage built on respect and shared work and real affection, that she had loved him and missed him, and that missing him had taught her something about the nature of loss, which was that it did not prevent new things from being true. She told him about the 2 years alone, which had been hard and had also, she admitted, been clarifying, because she had learned exactly what she was capable of and what she wanted, and she found she was grateful for the clarity even as she had hated the price of it. Henry listened to all of this with the attention that was his particular gift, and when she finished he said, "You are the most complete person I have ever met." She thought about that word for a long time. "Complete," she said. "Most people are waiting to become something," he said. "You already are what you are, you just keep adding to it." She did not know exactly what to say to that, which was unusual for her. And so she stopped walking and stood in the cold February street and kissed him instead, which communicated most of what she meant. He was, she thought, the best possible answer to questions she had not known she was asking. February moved into March, and the circuit judge arrived, and Harlan Doyle was brought before the court in the building that served Caldwell as both the courthouse and the meeting hall depending on the day. Susan testified with the same precision she brought to her accounts, every detail clear and sequential, and the second witness, Mrs. Marjorie Elkins, testified with quiet courage that Susan respected deeply. Miles Archer's written statement was entered into evidence. Caleb's account was heard. Doyle's lawyer did exactly what Pierce had predicted, challenging the clarity of the night, the reliability of memory, the business motivations of the witnesses, and Doyle himself sat through the proceedings with his small eyes moving around the room with an expression that Susan refused to look at for long, because it made her want to say things that were not compatible with a court of law. The judge was a man named Aldous Finch, 60 years old, with a white beard and the eyes of a man who had heard a great many lies and grown tired of them. He listened to everything with complete patience, and then deliberated for 3 hours, and returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of arson, sentencing Doyle to 4 years in the state penitentiary and the forfeiture of his mercantile to pay restitution. Susan sat in the hard courthouse bench and received this verdict with perfect stillness. Around her, people shifted and exhaled and made small sounds of satisfaction or discomfort depending on their position. Henry was beside her, and he did not put his arm around her or make any dramatic gesture. He simply reached over and covered her hand with his once briefly, and she felt it all the way through. Outside the courthouse in the cold March air, with the last snow of winter still banked along the boardwalks and the sky a thin and brilliant blue, Susan stood and breathed the clean cold and felt something she could only describe as settled. Not triumphant, not relieved in a theatrical sense, just settled. The thing was done. The truth had been said out loud in a room full of people, and the consequences had been applied. It was not everything. It could not undo the night of orange fire and lost work and the months of fear and anger she had carried, but it was something real and official, and she let it matter. Henry came to stand beside her. "How are you?" he asked. "Ready," she said. He looked at her. "Ready for what?" She turned to face him in the cold March light, and she had been thinking about this for weeks, had turned it over quietly and reached her position with the same care she brought to everything, and she said it. "I want to marry you, Henry." He went very still. "I know you were going to ask me," she said, because she was fairly certain he was going to ask her, and she had simply grown tired of waiting and decided to do it herself, which seemed consistent with every other choice she had made in the past several months. He looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. Then his expression broke open into that smile she had first seen on the roof in October, warm and real and changing his whole face. He said. "I was going to ask you in April when the farm was showing its spring. I had a speech prepared." "I am sure it was a very good speech," she said. "It was," he said. "I worked on it for 3 weeks." "You can still give it to me," she said. "I want to hear it." He laughed, a real open laugh that she had come to love, and he took both her hands in the cold air outside the courthouse with half of Caldwell streaming past them, and he said, "Susan Whitfield, I came to this town looking for land that would stay still long enough to grow something. I did not expect to find the most honest and capable and remarkable person I have ever known standing in a pile of rubble measuring things with her boot heel. I would like, very much, to spend the rest of my life being the person who is allowed to stand near you while you build things. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, and she was smiling so hard it was difficult to say it clearly. "I said yes 3 minutes ago." "I know," he said, "but now we have said it properly." He kissed her right there in the courthouse yard with the March wind blowing cold and the last snow gleaming and the whole town of Caldwell going about its business around them, and she held the front of his coat with both hands and kissed him back and felt completely and entirely herself. They were married in May, when the Kansas prairie was green and the wildflowers were out in great sweeping drifts of color, and the sky was the high, clear blue that only appears for a few weeks at the turn of the season before the summer heat sets in. The wedding was held in the Methodist church where they had stood at Christmas, small and honest, with Jesse and his mother, Mrs. Haverford, and a handful of people who had become genuinely dear to Susan over the hard months of rebuilding. Susan wore a dress she had made herself from good blue wool, not a wedding dress in the traditional sense, but a dress that was entirely hers, the color of the spring sky, simply cut, and she wore her dark hair up with Thomas's pearl hairpin, which she had kept, and which she felt was not a contradiction but a continuity, a life that held all its chapters without canceling any of them. Henry wore his best suit, which he had bought new for the occasion in Wichita, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her walk down the short aisle with an expression on his face that made Mrs. Haverford, who was generally a very composed woman, press her handkerchief to her eyes. The vows they spoke were the traditional ones, but they said them with the particular weight of people who had actually thought about what the words meant. And when the minister said to love and to cherish, Susan looked at Henry and felt the full substance of it. the weight of a promise made between two people who had already shown each other, in the most practical and daily ways, exactly what they were. After the ceremony, there was a dinner at the community hall, modest and warm, with good food and the fiddle player from the Christmas dance and a great deal of laughter. Jessie made a toast that was brief and heartfelt and slightly embarrassing to Henry, who received it with good grace. Mrs. Haverford said nothing, but held Susan's hands for a long moment before dinner, and looked at her with the kind of understanding that does not need words. Henry danced with her twice at the celebration, which was, given that he was the groom, entirely appropriate, and when they danced the second time he held her close enough that she could hear him say, low and quiet near her ear, that he was the luckiest man in Kansas, and possibly in the territories. She told him she thought he might be right. They went home to his farm that evening, the farm that was now their farm, driving out to the edge of town in the late spring dark with the stars out enormous above the flat land and the smell of new grass and turned earth coming off the fields. The farmhouse was solid and plain and had been tidied by Henry's housekeeper, who had also left a cold supper and a jar of wildflowers on the kitchen table, and Susan stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it and felt something simple and enormous moving through her. This was home. This was the next thing, and it was good. The summer of 1880 was the best one Susan had known in years. The store did vigorous business as the cattle season opened again, and Caldwell filled with drovers and buyers and all the industry of the Kishom Trail end. And Henry's farm produced its first real harvest, a good crop of corn and a smaller but solid wheat yield, and they fell into a life together that was busy and practical, and also filled with the kind of daily pleasure that comes from sharing it with exactly the right person. She ran the store through the week and kept her own accounts with the precision she had always brought to them, and he managed the farm and came into town 3 times a week and ate dinner with her behind the store counter, when the day ran long and they could not get home in time for a proper meal. And these counter dinners, with the lamplight and the accounts books spread between them and both of them talking about their respective days, were among the happiest hours she knew. He was, she discovered in the intimacy of marriage, exactly who he had shown himself to be, which was something she had hoped but not taken entirely for granted, because she had known people whose private selves were different from their presented ones. Henry was the same all the way through, patient, attentive, direct, capable of silence that was companionable rather than cold, capable of conversation that was real. He was also funny, in a dry and quiet way that still caught her off guard sometimes, and she liked this particularly, liked that there was still something new to discover. She told him things she had not told anyone else, some of the harder things, the fear she had carried in the 2 years of running the store alone, the particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being without company, but from being without someone to whom you could say the true version of things. He listened and received what she said without trying to fix it or minimize it, and he told her things in return, the loneliness of the mining years, the grief of his brother's changed self after the war, the fear that the farm would fail, and he would have to begin again somewhere else without having ever built anything that lasted. This lasts, she told him one evening in late summer, sitting on the porch of the farmhouse with the prairie spread out in front of them going gold in the last light. This is the thing that lasts. He took her hand. Yes, he said, it is. In September, just past the first anniversary of the fire, Susan discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Henry on a Sunday morning at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold in front of her, and she watched his face and saw the same careful, still joy she had seen when she said she loved him, and she thought she would never get tired of seeing that expression. "Are you well?" He asked, which was the first thing he said, and it was the right first thing. "I am very well," she said. "I am tired and I have been sick in the mornings, but I feel well in the way that matters." He got up from his side of the table and came around and crouched beside her chair so they were eye to eye and took both her hands and said, quietly and entirely, "I am so happy." "I know," she said. "I can see." She was almost 29 years old and he was 33, and neither of them took any of this for granted. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, and the town's women, who had never quite forgiven Susan for not collapsing properly after the fire, found this occasion more manageable and came to her with advice and assistance in ways that were sometimes excessive, but mostly genuinely kind. And Susan accepted the kindness with more grace than she had managed in the immediate aftermath of the fire, partly because she had learned something about receiving help without losing herself, and partly because Henry was there this time, and his steadiness made everything easier. He was attentive through the months in the way she had come to expect from him, which was to say practically and completely, ensuring the farmhouse was warm and the stove was always fed, and that she was not lifting anything she should not be lifting, which she occasionally disputed and he occasionally won. He came to the store every afternoon to help with the closing inventory so she was not on her feet for the full day, and he drove her to town and back every morning even when she said she could manage the wagon herself. And she let him because she understood by now that caring for her was something he needed to do as much as she needed to be independent, and that these two things were not actually in conflict if you arranged them correctly. The baby was born in May of 1881 in the bedroom of the farmhouse, attended by the town doctor and Mrs. Haverford, who had appointed herself to this role without being asked, and whom Susan was genuinely glad to have. Henry was in the kitchen, which was where men were in those circumstances, and Susan knew he was there and felt the nearness of him like a physical warmth even through the long, difficult hours. The baby was a boy. A solid, loud, healthy boy who arrived at dawn and announced himself with the kind of insistence that suggested he would have opinions all his life. Henry came into the bedroom when the doctor called him, and he stood over the small bundle in Susan's arms with his face completely undone, every particle of his usual composure dissolved in something simpler and more absolute than anything she had seen from him before. "He looks like he is angry about something," Henry said, in a voice she had never heard from him. "He is announcing himself," Susan said. "He comes by it honestly." Henry sat beside her on the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched Henry hold his son for the first time with the same careful competence he brought to everything, the same total attention, and she thought that some things in a life are so complete that you can simply receive them. "What do we name him?" Henry asked. They had discussed names and they had a short list, but they had agreed to see the child before deciding. "Thomas," she said, and watched Henry's face. He looked at her. She had not put Thomas Whitfield's name on the list. He knew whose name it was. "If you are willing," she said. He looked at her for a long moment and then he looked down at the baby. "Thomas Henry Vaughn," he said quietly. "That is a name that carries something." "Two good men," she said. He looked up at her. "Susan," he said, and his voice was rough. "Two good men," she said again, "and one very loud, healthy boy who deserves both of them in his name." Henry bent his head and pressed his lips to the baby's forehead, and then he reached up with one arm and drew Susan against his side, and they sat in the early morning light of the bedroom with their son between them. And outside the Kansas prairie was beginning its bright spring morning, and the wildflowers were coming up again in the fields, and the store in town was waiting quietly for its work week, and the farm was growing its good crop in the dark soil. And everything that had been built from the ruins of that terrible fire, everything that had been hammered and framed and fitted and raised from nothing, was exactly where it was supposed to be. In the years that followed, the story of Henry Vaughn and Susan Whitfield became the kind of story a town carries without knowing exactly why. Something passed along in the particular way that true things are passed along, with less embellishment than fiction because reality, at its best, needs none. People remembered that Susan Whitfield had stood in the ruins of her store and not wept, and that Henry Vaughn had walked up to her with a level gaze and told her the foundation was solid and she could build on it. People remembered, some of them, that every other man in town had offered her sympathy, and that he had offered her work instead, People did not always say this directly, but they said it in the ways that mattered, in the slightly warmer tone they used when they spoke of either of them, in the way younger women who were facing their own ruins sometimes found themselves thinking of Susan Whitfield specifically rather than generally. Whitfield Dry Goods became the best-supplied store in Caldwell and remained so for many years, and Susan ran it with the same clear-eyed competence she had always brought to it. And Henry's farm grew and employed 4 men year-round by the mid-1880s, and together they built the kind of life that looks simple from the outside and is enormously substantial from the inside. Thomas Henry Vaughn grew up loud and opinionated and entirely himself, with his mother's facility for numbers and his father's patience, a combination that would serve him well. He was followed, 3 years later, by a second child, a girl they named Clara, who arrived in the world with a quietness that was entirely her own, and which she maintained with remarkable consistency throughout a childhood spent largely outdoors on the Kansas prairie, with her brother alternately including and excluding her from his games and her parents alternately managing and enjoying the chaos of 2 children and a working farm and a business in town. The store expanded twice in its first decade. The farm added a proper barn in 1884 and a new well in 1886. The farmhouse gained a proper parlor in 1885, which Henry built over the course of a winter, consulting Susan at every stage with the same sketched-out plans on paper he had used for the store, and which she modified and improved as they went. It was the most pleasant project she had ever collaborated on, and when it was finished, it was both exactly right and entirely theirs. Jessie, Henry's farm hand, married a young woman named Agnes in the summer of 1882 and settled in Caldwell for good, and he and Henry had the kind of working friendship that deepens over years of shared labor and mutual respect. Agnes and Susan liked each other with the direct simplicity of women who have better things to do than perform friendship, and this was sufficient for a genuine one. Mrs. Haverford died in the winter of 1883, peacefully, in her own house, and Susan sat with her in her last days, and was glad she had been there all those months after the fire, glad for the kitchen corner and the coffee and the parlor and the quiet, practical support of a woman who had never needed to make a production of her kindness. The Kishom Trail era wound down through the 1880s as the railroads extended their reach, and the cattle drives changed their character, and Caldwell changed with it, as all the frontier towns changed, becoming something somewhat less wild and somewhat more settled, with a school and a church of decent size and a newspaper and the ordinary machinery of a town finding its permanent shape. Susan served on the school board for 3 years in the late 1880s and was, by general consensus, the most useful member of it, because she read the budget proposals with the attention of someone who could spot an error at 20 paces and was not interested in politics for its own sake. Henry, asked by several people over the years whether he would stand for town council, consistently declined with the same pleasant simplicity. He was a farmer, he said, and farmers needed to be in their fields. He was, as far as Susan could tell, entirely content with this answer and entirely content with his life, and she found his contentment one of the most genuinely restful things about him, because it was not complacency. It was the satisfaction of someone who had built what he intended to build and was watching it flourish. They were happy. This is the simple fact and the most important one, and it deserves to be said plainly. Not happy in the way that stories sometimes describe, as a permanent radiant state that hovers above ordinary life, but happy in the real way, which is built out of thousands of mornings and evenings and ordinary days, out of decisions made together and problems solved together, and the accumulated weight of choosing each other continuously over time. They had disagreements because 2 people of strong character and independent judgment will, and they navigated them with the same plain-speaking habit they had established in the earliest days of knowing each other, which was sometimes uncomfortable and always preferable to the alternatives. Henry was sometimes too slow to say what he was feeling, and Susan would call this out directly, and he would tell her she was right and then say it, and the problem was solved. Susan was sometimes too certain of her own position before she had heard all the relevant information, and Henry would say so in his quiet way, and she would consider it and usually agree, and the problem was solved. They were, in the most fundamental sense, on the same side, and they both knew it. On an evening in the autumn of 1890, 11 years after the fire, Susan stood in the doorway of the store she had rebuilt from the ground up and looked at the autumn light lying long and golden across the Caldwell Main Street. Thomas was 9 and Clara was 6, and the store was full of good stock, and the farm had had its best harvest in 5 years. She was 38 years old, and she was, by any measure she could apply, exactly where she was supposed to be. She heard the particular sound of Henry's wagon, and she turned. He was coming down the street in the amber afternoon light, easy in the seat the way a man is easy when he has been driving the same roads for a long time, and he saw her in the doorway and raised one hand. She raised hers in return. He pulled the wagon to the post outside the store and climbed down and came up to her and stood the way he always stood, direct and unhurried, and looked at her with those level gray eyes that had been looking at her honestly for 11 years. "Good day," he asked. "Very good," she said. "Yours. The north field came in clean," he said. "I think we are done for the season." "Good," she said. "Then you can help me move those shelving units to the east wall before winter. I have been thinking about the layout." "I have been thinking about the layout since August," he said. She stared at him. "Why did you not say anything?" "I was waiting for you to come to the same conclusion," he said. "It seemed faster." She stood for a moment absorbing this, and then she laughed, the way she laughed with him, fully and without reservation, and he smiled that smile that still changed his whole face, and the autumn light lay warm and golden around them both. "Come inside," she said. "I will show you the sketch I made." "I have already made a sketch," he said. "Then let us compare them," she said. "They will probably be the same," he said. "They usually are," she agreed. She turned and he followed her into the store, and the door swung closed behind them against the golden afternoon, and inside it was warm and ordered and exactly as they had built it, and they spread their 2 sketches side by side on the counter and found they were, in fact, nearly identical, and this pleased them both for reasons that went beyond the shelving units and the east wall and the practical business of a well-run store in a Kansas town. Outside, the prairie was going gold in the late season light, and the cattle trail was quieter now than it had been in the old days, but the town was solid, and the people in it were building their lives with the same daily insistence that people have always brought to the work of living, and somewhere in the Northfield Henry's good harvest was in and done, and upstairs in the rooms above the store 2 children were doing their lessons, and the Kansas autumn was laying itself out in all its wide, indifferent, magnificent beauty, and Susan Whitfield, who was now Susan Vaughn but still went by Whitfield at the store because that was what the sign said, and she saw no reason to change a sign. That was perfectly good, was standing at her counter with the man she loved, comparing sketches, arguing gently about the placement of a shelf, and building, as she had always built, one careful and decided thing at a time. The fire had taken everything she had, and she had turned around and made something so much better that sometimes, when the light came through the good front window Henry had hung, she felt almost grateful, and then corrected herself, because gratitude for destruction was not what she meant. What she meant was something more precise, that what had been built from the ruins was more entirely hers than what had stood before, because she had built it with her own eyes open, in her own hardest season, with help she had chosen freely from a man who had walked up to her wreckage and offered not his pity but his hands. He had been the only man in town who did not offer her sympathy after the fire. He had handed her a hammer instead. And from that first morning, everything else had followed.